Hey y'all, welcome to another episode of Poli-Side-Eye. I am back with my co-host Jared. So we recently did something for my Patreon. It was non-political related, and we were talking about dating, specifically the difference between, in your 20s and 30s. It was followed by a Q&A, and then I was so inspired by the Q&A about how much I learned and how good the questions were, I wanted to extend it to the YouTube audience. So we're going to start. We had a good amount of questions. I gave y'all 24 hours, so you can't be mad. Let's get right into it. So this is from Magra453. Do you think that Clarence Thomas will face punishment or at least forced into retirement? Before you answer, what did Clarence Thomas do?
Long story short, he had been embroiled in some financial controversies, potentially taking bribes, although it's always hard to prove whether or not someone is being bribed because the barrier, or let's say the evidence you have to bring forth to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that someone changed their behavior as a result of some type of financial gift they may have received is almost impossible. Although the question itself for a lot of people raises issues of ethics. So did he act unethically? There's never a right or wrong answer to that. So that's kind of the context behind it. So to answer the question, I would say probably not, because it's so hard to bring to bear, like I said, the type of evidence that could prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that, let's say, he cast a vote on the Supreme Court that was a result of something that somebody slid him under the table. So that's one reason why I wouldn't expect anything to happen. Another reason is because people in Washington are what's called institutionalists, which means that they believe very strongly in the institutions in which they serve. So people in Congress believe in the institution of Congress. People on the courts believe in the judicial system. And so because people believe in the legitimacy of these systems, even when people, let's say, do something that somebody may find appalling, the inclination is usually not to remove the person, because people who believe in institutions fear that taking such a drastic action would call into question the legitimacy of the institution altogether. That's part of the reason it's really, really rare to see people impeached. It's even less common to see people removed from office, because when that happens, people generally lose faith in the institutions. So I don't expect to see something that drastic happen to him for those reasons.
Okay. I mean, do you think he's going to retire anytime soon?
He's only in his early 70s, which in the Supreme Court is young. The Supreme Court is, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was almost 90 when she died in the court. So, Clarence Thomas could reasonably have at least another decade or plus on the court easily. It's just a whole bunch of old people. So, no, I don't expect, and especially not under a Democratic president. So they wouldn't want to replace him with someone more liberal. So he's going to hang on as long as he can. So, yeah, no, I don't see him retiring anytime soon, unless he gets to the point where he's physically or mentally incapacitated.
Great.
Also, one other thing, I took a really, really cool class when I was at LSU called the History of Scandal. And so we talked about how scandals themselves, once they enter the political arena, people tend to err on the side of, let's try to figure out how to make it work, because we don't want to implicate the entire institution altogether. That's why Watergate ended up being such a big thing, because to have a sitting president resign, public confidence in government has never recovered from that. So up until Watergate, a pretty overwhelming number of Americans, in the 60s or 70s, trusted in government. They trusted Congress, they trusted the president. Now, Congress is rated less favorably than cockroaches. Everybody hates Congress. And a lot of that is because of the cumulative effects of scandals, robbery, and all that kind of shit. So, but I still stand what I said, which is that I don't think that Clarence Thomas will get the boot.
Next question is from Terry Witherspoon 5079. This question doesn't involve politics, but can you and Jared give your thoughts on long distance relationships? More specifically, the price you pay eventually when moving to the same city with your partner with no community available.
So my thought on that is, I think that's a very honest question. I think that as someone who's been in a long distance relationship, there are really hard questions that come up about like, what do you do so that the two of you can be in the same place, which is going to require an immense amount of sacrifice on one or both of the parties. Usually one person kind of has to shoulder more of the sacrifice, I found, than others. But I think it's a fair question. I don't think there's like a blueprint to it. It really all boils down to, what do you really desire from partnership? I mean, only you can answer that question. So I don't really know what else to add to that.
My thoughts on long distance relationships, I mean, I can do it for a certain amount of time. It can't be longer than 6 months, or we're going to have to figure something out. It's just how I particularly feel.
But are you willing to, hypothetically, you meet somebody and they live in not even like a big city. Let's say they live in like Little Rock, Arkansas. You're head over heels for them, and they have no willingness to move to New York. Would you just be like, well, not for me?
I'm not moving to a red state for anybody. I'll move to like one of the Northeast states. Not going back to Atlanta. I go to the West Coast, but maybe even Chicago. But yeah, it really just depends.
You're making my point, which is that there's no blueprint to these things. There's so many things to consider. So it's hard to like answer that in the hypothetical. I feel like I'd be disingenuous if I was like, this is what's going to happen. And is your partner enough to compensate for those experiences that you may have otherwise had if you would have stayed where you were? Don't know. But I think those are all fair questions that people have to think about and reckon with.
That is true. Next is from Shakira77. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what happened with the two Black Democratic lawmakers in Tennessee. So they were ousted at first, and then they were let back in.
Yeah, they were expelled while in legislative session, and then after an uproar, were welcomed back into the body. I didn't really follow the event that closely, to be frank. To be honest, I found a lot of it to be theater, especially the way that the two expelled members, the two Black men, acted in the wake of everything that was going on. To me, it felt like they were trying to cosplay as like 1960s civil rights leaders, which I generally find people who pretend to be that. I just find it really weird and just frankly weird. Like, why do you need to do that whole performance? Like, it just feels really, I don't get it. Like, I honestly don't. Yeah.
I thought you were going to say freedom fighters, but I mean, it was racist.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, the bigger question is like, why is something like this happening when it's happening? And I think if you're just like, oh, well, this is just another instance of like the Tennessee legislature trying to impose Jim Crow, I think you missed the point. Like, really what's going on, the reason you're seeing these especially southern states, but not exclusively, but the reason why you're seeing a lot of these state legislatures or these state governing bodies do these things, or we kind of talked about this in the Patreon episode, so if you want to learn more, go sign up for Chris's Patriot. But anyway, we kind of talked about this a little bit where, the Republican Party is kind of caught between a rock and a hard place because their basic political program is to fuck poor people, to fuck pretty much anybody who is not in the top 1%, even that, really more like the top 10th of 1%. Their policies are all about redistributing wealth upwards to like the riches of the rich. But you can't go to people and say that. Like, if you ran the platform of like, hey, like the reason we exist is to fuck you, who's going to vote for you? So you have to figure out something else to do. Now, the Democratic Party, as I've said before, is also committed to capitalism, perhaps not as aggressively so, but still very much, they don't really question the general status quo. And so what ends up happening is that the way that the parties distinguish themselves is through focusing on these really, really divisive issues. And so, like, as I've said before, because in the United States, race is the primary way that most people understand difference. And so it's really easy to get people riled up around this stuff. And so the Democratic Party has no issue with it because it riles up their base. It mobilizes them to come out to the polls. And the same is true for Republicans. And so you have to wage these issues in this really divisive space because that's the only way that you can generate excitement on either side, because we don't have discussions about fiscal policy or like things that can meaningfully change people's material conditions. So like you have to find other issues to focus on. And so I think we need to be honest about that, because it's going to keep happening. It's going to get worse as capitalism degenerates more and more, which it is. These types of issues are going to be like the critical race theory stuff, the overtly racist stuff is going to get worse, because that's the only way that the Republican Party can distinguish itself.
I mean, the main purpose was gun control, and I feel like we're not going to get that anytime soon.
No, absolutely not. I mean, you just don't have the majorities to do that, honestly, in hardly any of these legislative bodies.
Next question is from Plums Galore. How might the BRICS currency impact the US dollar in our economy?
Once again, you should sign up for Chris's Patreon, because we kind of talked about this, what I call dollar hegemony, which is just a fancy way of saying that the US dollar is the global trading currency for the most part.
What does BRICS stand for?
Yeah, so BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So some time ago, I don't know the exact year, maybe like 2 decades, maybe 3. These countries, which were then considering, you've heard the term like developing countries. So these were countries that most of their development didn't happen in, let's say, the wake of the post-World War II period. So after Europe was pretty much blown to smithereens, that's when most of Europe saw a lot of its development happen in the wake of World War II. Same with Japan, because they also were in that war. But all of these developing nations essentially have been forging this pact to really think about how they can become more autonomous in their development and in their growth. And so in the last like year or two, there's been this push, especially because of China, and to a lesser extent Russia, because China has been the fastest growing economy in the world now for like at least the last 2 decades, maybe longer. China is also 3 times the size of the United States in terms of population, and is also growing faster. So now China is in a position with their BRICS allies to be like, hey, maybe now that we have a little bit of power, we don't have to subject ourselves to the wills of the master, in this case, the United States. And so, as I kind of talked about on the Patreon, since the dollar is the world's global currency, pretty much the entire financial system is structured to benefit, first and foremost, investors in the US and consumers to a lesser extent. So part of the reason we've gotten all this free, or not free, but like cheap clothing, everything we see made in China, made in Malaysia, all that stuff has been a direct result of this. But it hurts everybody else to a lesser extent, because they have to essentially produce for us. And so now these countries are like, we're tired of playing second fiddle to the United States. Let's kind of evaluate how we can have a system that doesn't have the dollar as the main currency, and do something that's more democratic, that's more equitable. Of course, the United States is fighting this tooth and nail, because they don't want to lose the power for a ton of reasons. Like we talked in the show, like the United States isn't the world's global currency anymore. That's going to mean pretty much everything that we have to consume is going to be infinitely more expensive. So there are political reasons for it, but there's also like geopolitical reasons for it. Like the United States views itself as an empire. And because it views itself as an empire, one of the ways that it's able to get people to bend to its will is through having the dollar as a global currency. So it definitely represents a really strong threat. You will never hear about this in the news in America, because they don't want people to know that America as an empire is in decline, but it's definitely happening. And so I would say within the next decade, this is something to keep your eye on, because it's going to have implications for everybody, not only in the United States, but globally.
Wow. Yeah, I remember that conversation. So yeah, I'm familiar with that now. Next is from Betsy Johnson. Any thoughts about Tim Scott running for president and his political existence in general? Does he have any redeeming qualities?
Tim Scott is a part of the Republican Party. The Republican Party, as I said before, their main policy or their main platform is fuck everybody that's not a rich investor, and pretty much explicit white supremacy. If Tim Scott is a part of that party, I fully would expect him to endorse similar policies. Now, whether or not you think that's a good or a bad set of policies to endorse I can't tell you one way or the other. I personally don't think they are, but you might.
I don't know Tim Scott. I don't know that man. I could see him.
He's a Black junior senator from South Carolina.
Oh, I know him. Yeah. This Lost my appetite. Thank you, Betsy, for your question. Next up is Ray Ray all day. I love your show. Thank you very much. Will the $6 billion decrease of student loan debt have a direct effect on real estate or any other prime source of income?
What's the 6 billion decrease? I don't know what that's about.
Let's see.
Oh, I see. The U.S. Department of Education. So yes, I did see that. I just didn't really put two and two together. But anyway, there are a number of schools which are called for-profit institutions, which it was discovered that they were purposely misleading students into signing up and paying all this tuition for essentially these fraudulent degrees. And so you pretty much strapped all of these students with all this debt. And so the Supreme Court, so they sued, the students, sued because they were essentially like, this is fraud. And so the Supreme Court, I believe yesterday or maybe a few days ago, or I don't remember when it was, but recently said that they were gonna let the Department of Education essentially cancel the debt of the people who were victims of fraud by all of these for-profit universities. Now, the question is that gonna have any impact on what?
Real estate or any prime source of income?
As in, could the people who are now getting this cancellation, will they be better positioned to like buy property or something? I mean, I'm assuming that's what they mean. That's kind of a hard question to answer. I would need to know where the people lived, what is their financial profile, like most of these people were already pretty poor or at least lower income. So the odds of them being able to like, I don't know, buy property or like stocks or something, like it's kind of hard to answer that question because I don't know enough about the people who were affected to make any predictions about like how that might influence their future investment behaviors, if they have any at all.
Okay, well, Ray all day, if you want to put a follow-up question under this.
Yeah, well, I have to clarify further. I didn't quite know what else to say.
Yeah. Miss Cassandra D asks, I would love for y'all to talk about the travel dangers happening in Mexico that the media is covering. How will that shape any future travel policies? I'm guessing because like recently they had this Black couple. Did you hear about it? Like, I think they allegedly went to get like a surgery or something, elective surgery, and they got kidnapped by the cartel or something.
Yeah. My answer to that is, I think a lot of that is fear mongering, to be honest. That's not to say that can't happen, but I'm not convinced that there has been some like systematic increase. Maybe there are a couple, it's kind of like the crime thing. Like people are under this impression that there's been this huge like uptick in crime, which there was a so-called COVID spike. We did see violent crime go up during COVID. This is true most places, but in most cities, it's already coming back down. At least the 2022 to 2023 trends are trending downward. So a lot of this is, in my view, an overreaction to what is a blip in an otherwise clear trend, which is that violence in not only the United States, but most of North America has been trending downward over the past like 5 decades. We know that when economies get worse, that tends to make crime go up because people become more desperate. So you do see more petty crimes, not necessarily violent crimes, but a lot of petty crimes, car break-ins, car thefts, pickpocketing, things like that. And so I'm not familiar enough with the data in Mexico to know what the trends were there. So I don't want to say that what's been going on is necessarily evidence of like some broader trend that we need to be concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I've been hearing like, a lot of stories lately about Mexico, people dying or getting kidnapped, etc. I mean, would that affect you going to Mexico, hearing that?
No, I just went to Mexico like a few months ago. It had no bearing at all on it would not have had any bearing on what decision I made. Because I also see through the media, like people have to remember the media in the United States is controlled by Disney, CBS, and NBC Universal, which are all corporations, and corporations' main task is to generate profits. What are they going to do to generate profits? Get eyeballs or clicks. What's going to produce that? Usually things that are, let's say, sensational or things that are exciting. They're not going to report boring data points that don't give you the juicy story.
Next question is from the Carmel Swan. Any thoughts on the grand jury process for the shooting of Jalen Walker in Akron, Ohio? A decision is expected this week. My hometown is bracing for riots.
I don't really have anything to add to that. I mean, anything beyond just speculation. Don't really have much to add to that one.
Oh, okay. I didn't know a decision was expected this week. I'm wondering, like, we have so many of these like crimes happening. Actually, we have breaking news because 29 minutes ago, it says grand jury declines to indict Akron police officers in killing of Jalen Walker.
Wow, declines to indict. So wow, they're good to go, good to walk.
Right. This just came like on CNN at 8:02. A special grand jury in Ohio declined to indict the police officers who fatally shot Jalen Walker, a 25-year-old Black man, dozens of times after a car chase and foot chase last year. The grand jury concluded the officers were legally justified in their use of force, according to Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost. Next is from Danny Webb, 1971. Let's talk about the fact that there is no real breakout candidate for either party and elections are in 19 months.
Good. The less we have to hear about that horse race, the better. So we get a little bit more time to spare before we just have a barrage of election campaign stuff. I'll take it.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous because
on the Democratic side, I mean, the Democratic Party is pretty much saying that this is Biden's. We don't need somebody running against us. That's kind of the expectation. Like, you don't run against a sitting president running for re-election. Now, on the Republican side, from all indications, it seems like Ron DeSantis is trying to groom himself. But does he have the range? TBD.
All right, so next question is from 12 Mina Love. What topics you think are going to be hot topics in the 2024 elections? Can I guess?
Yeah, go for it.
Gun control.
Yeah.
The economy, inflation and all that shit.
Mm-hmm.
I believe LGBT rights.
Yeah, I can see that being
rights.
Yeah. I think the abortion issue is still going to be pretty big too. Like women's reproductive issues, I should say. I think everything else you said are pretty standard. Yeah. I mean, unless there's always some major event that could happen between now and then. I don't know, but
I just can't believe like it's really 19 months away. Yeah, it is.
Don't remind me.
What happened?
They don't remind me. I hate election time.
Right. And I need Trump to go to jail. But I know he's not, because I know it's just political theater. But I feel like he's going to run again.
He already announced, I thought.
That he is?
I thought so.
Yeah, I think he is. But I'm like, you know what? People will still vote for him.
Yeah, totally. I totally think.
So our last question, and I feel like this just went by so fast, but it's from OA7714. I'd love y'all thoughts on religious fundamentalism and how that's affecting policy.
I mean, religious fundamentalism has been affecting policy since the birth of the American Republic. Again, as I've said before, because race is generally the main social cleavage that people have a coherent and readily available language to discuss, I think we forget the degree to which religion was also baked into the American project. America was, even though it was never explicitly stated, it was in some places it was, but although it was supposed to be a place of religious freedom, there were very strong Protestant ideas that were adopted in the way that the main governing documents were formed and stuff. And so there's always been that religious bias that has been inherent in American politics. And so when it comes to religious fundamentalism in the US, there's been a movement of white evangelicals really since the late 60s, early 70s. And part of the reason that they have been so influential in crafting policy is because the Republican Party of the mid 20th century, so there were kind of two parts of the Republican Party. So you had what were called neoconservatives. So neoconservatives were people that generally believed in the nuclear family. They believed specifically the white nuclear family. They believed in heteronormative ideals. In other words, that men should be men, that women should be women, and women should be subordinate to men, and men should be the breadwinner. A very traditional, what they call traditional morality. What ends up happening is that the Republican Party in the mid 20th century was not really doing that well in the face of liberalism. Although some Republicans were liberal back then, but I won't get into that. The way that the Republican Party rebranded itself is by adopting this like traditional morality framework. And so people like George H.W. Bush, the president that succeeded Reagan, he was entirely pro-choice for most of his political life. And then once he started getting funded or getting money from like these evangelical zealots, he switched on the dime and became super pro-choice. Reagan did the same thing. Reagan was pretty agnostic to abortion and that type of stuff, then starts getting a little money and power. And then what does he do? He switches to the pro-choice. And so like a lot of Republicans ended up doing that. And part of the reason that they did that is because, as I said before, religion there's always been this Protestant bias within American politics. And so it's been a really cynical way to get people to support the Republican Party, not on the grounds of their actual policies, which is, again, as I've said repeatedly, to fuck everybody that's not a rich investor, and try to like essentially wage these wars over gender stuff, over LGBT issue, like stuff that will always get the people riled up. That's how they've waged those wars. So yeah, religious fundamentalism has been inherent to American politics, and it's not going to go away because, again, as I've said before, because the parties agree on so much in terms of economics, like the only places that they can distinguish themselves is in the realm of cultural issues.
And then, I mean, it's on the money, and God we trust.
All
And
of that was added later, just like this
oh,
all came out of this movement though. In God We Trust, or in the Pledge of Allegiance under God, that was all added.
oh,
That was not, yeah, all of that was that came later. Part of this was in response to again, this cynical political strategy, which is all of these rich Republicans being like, we don't give a shit about God or any of that stuff, but we know that people do. So we'll cynically make it a political issue. So we'll always have a solid base.
well, okay. I learned something from every question. But yeah, this was a two-part question actually, and it was they asked also your thoughts on the unionization movements happening across the country.
I'm really struck by them. I think it's a great development. I think most people are starting to see that the only way that you can fight against your employer or against your bosses for what you deserve is by organizing with other people who also are fighting for what they deserve. And so people are going to have to keep it up, because the only time there's been any type of positive political change in the United States and in most Western countries has been when there's been a strong labor movement. And so absent that, it generally won't happen. So that's pretty much the only vessel that people have at the moment to really change politics in a significant way. So more of it. I'm really heartened to see it.
Okay. Do you have an example like of a unionization movement?
Yeah, the reason we have a 5-day work week is all because of unionization and labor movements. I mean, before we had kids working in sweatshops, people were working around violent conditions in the industrial mills and things. And so because of labor movements pushing to impose both child protection laws, the 40-hour work week, things like that have all been accomplished because of labor organizing and struggling against bosses.
Okay. Look, the more you know. Well, yeah, those were our questions, y'all. Thank you for those who participated. Again, I learned a lot. If we didn't fully answer your question, please just put a follow-up to like describe your question a little bit more so Jared can answer it, because we do read the comments, especially me. So as we're leaving, I mean, do you have just like a random book you can suggest to anybody, or what you're reading right now?
I'm always reading multiple things at once. I don't think anything I'm reading right now would be of interest to anybody. unless you're just really into philosophy. But if you are really into philosophy, I'm reading this book by this author named Herbert Marcuse, who was what was called a critical theorist in the mid 20th century, so writing kind of after World War II and into the 60s and 70s. And so he wrote his most famous book is this book called One Dimensional Man. And what it talks about is how mass consumption, the culture associated with it, he makes this case that it's turned people into one-dimensional creatures that can't think critically and are so obsessed with all of these like trinkets and things that they're so distracted by their desires that they can't focus on how they actually change the world around them for the better, is essentially the thrust of the argument.
Okay, and you're reading that book for fun.
Yeah, I am.
Okay, I was just wondering. That's all. I mean, you do.
Y'all know I'm lame.
You do research all the time.
Even things that I read, which is why, I kind of feel fortunate or lucky to kind of do what I do as an academic, because I pretty much get paid to think and write about what I'm thinking about. And I was going to be reading and thinking anyway. So it's kind of nice to be able to be compensated for that. But yeah, I don't want to glorify work too much, but I do appreciate the work that I do get to do.
Just living the American dream. I love it.
Hardly. Still exploited.
Well, y'all, that was our episode. Hopefully y'all learned something. I'm sure we'll be back. Please ask us questions. If you want to follow Jared, he is Jayctigerfan on Instagram and Twitter. Probably mostly just Twitter. He's never on Instagram like I am. No. But with that, y'all, make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe and share. And we will see y'all for the next episode. Bye.